Your Excellencies, dear Council members, colleagues and friends, on behalf of my fellow co-chairs, a warm welcome to this year's annual Council meeting of the European Council of Foreign Relations here in Stockholm. And where are we, more specifically? We are in the old post office on Vasagatan, or the street of Vasa. As a Dane, I obviously know who the street is named after. King Gustav Vasa, who 500 years and 1 day ago was elected King of Sweden. Because on the 6th of June, 1523, Sweden left the Kalmar Union, which was established in 1397. At that time, Denmark, Norway and Sweden were united in a union ruled by kings and queens in Denmark, and most notably, Margrethe I. So yesterday, 500 years ago, we had Svexit, where Sweden left Denmark and Norway, and that's what the Swedes are celebrating. Being a Dane, you may think that this is an unhappy time to visit Stockholm. As a matter of fact, my fellow co-chair, Carl Bildt, or the eternal Boy Scout, as the leading Swedish newspaper called him the other day, a few weeks ago in Tallinn reminded me that Denmark is the country that Sweden has fought most wars against. But these days, I can assure you, I can assure you we only fight our wars on the football field or at the Eurovision. And of course, we love to tease each other. Why does Denmark these days have better tennis players than Sweden? So what on earth happened to the country of Björn Borg? Why do Danes, according to the Swedes, speak as if they have a potato in their mouth? And why do Swedes put shrimp salad on their hot dogs, whereas Danes prefer pickles? I could continue this list, but then we wouldn't have time for the far more important discussions, also in the light of the tragic events of the destruction of the dam near Kherson. And don't worry, there was also a deeper meaning to this Nordic history for dummies. The most important lesson, now that we are once again experiencing a war on our continent, is that countries that have been foes for centuries can sometimes become friends and allies. Secondly, it's also important to note, going back to King Vasa's Svexit 500 years ago, that we are actually now much more united around the Baltic Sea region than we have been since the Kalmar Union. And no, I'm not just referring to the bridge, the physical one, and although you could say the TV series is great, no, I'm referring to the fact that security-wise, all countries around the Baltic Sea will soon be members of the same institutions. The EU and its defence dimension after last year's referendum on the Danish defence opt-out, and NATO after Finland's and Sweden's accession to NATO. This obviously puts us in a position where the Nordic voice can be much stronger and contribute to the many challenges that we are facing in Europe after Putin's invasion. At any rate, it is very clear that the time has now come for Europe to move beyond crisis management mode and develop long-term strategic thinking on how the EU can develop the capacity and the global coalitions to defend European interest in the world. So what are the challenges, the so-called polycrisis, that we'll try to tackle in the coming days here in Stockholm? Obviously, the many ripple effects of the tragic war in Ukraine, but also the question whether Europe has to find its role in a bipolar or multipolar world. We will focus upon the transatlantic relationship in the light of the upcoming American election and ask how will the Turkish election affect us all. Obviously, the Chinese-US relationship and what it means for Europe will also be on our agenda, Europe's role in tech and AI, the important question of whether Europe will become a hard power actor, a security provider, instead of security consumer. And of course, we will not forget an issue which has become truly high politics or geopolitics, if you like, climate and energy. Will this issue be crowded out by all the other topics European leaders have to deal with? And what about the public? Timothy Garton Ash put it eloquently, as always, in an interview with Der Spiegel a few weeks ago. Some worry about the end of the month, whereas others worry about the end of the planet, quote unquote. To answer all these questions, it is important that we steer clear of the trap of Europeans speaking to Europeans about global issues. So, obviously, we have a panel with, among others, the Minister of State and Foreign Affairs from Pakistan. And we also have the so-called Schmidt scholars with us, strong and impressive voices of the younger generation, so we steer clear of another trap, neglecting the younger generation, which will have to deal with the dire consequences if we fail to answer the questions I just mentioned. Before I give the floor to our first speaker, I'd like to thank the ECFR team, who has worked incredibly hard to make this conference happen, all the council members who have made their way to Sweden, especially the ones who attend our annual council for the first time. Thank you also to our media partner, Politico, and our Swedish host, Tack så mycket. And after all these thank yous, it is finally time to give the floor to our first speaker, one of Germany's best Zeitenwende experts and Welterklärer, Jana Puklerin, who's also, or maybe mainly, head of ECFR's Berlin office and senior fellow. So Jana, you will now give us an overview of what the European public thinks about all the challenges that I've mentioned. You will do that on the basis of brand new data that ECFR has just published today. So over to you, Jana.